If you're tired of these promos, supporters get the podcast early and ad-free. Just go to donate.bogosity.tv for the links to sign up. Welcome to the Bogosity podcast for the week of August 20, 2023, the podcast that aced the COVID test. This is your host, Shane Killian. Let's eventuate the news of the bogus. It's funny how a fake controversy gets spread all over the media, but the retraction of it barely gets a mention. Case in point, all of the denigration of ivermectin as a dangerous horse dewormer that should never be given to humans. 2 years ago, on August 21 of 2021, the FDA tweeted, "You are not a horse. You are not a cow. Seriously, y'all, stop it." This despite the fact that ivermectin had been safely prescribed for humans for decades for scabies, malaria, and various other parasitical diseases. It had also been shown to have antiviral properties in vitro, which is where yours truly comes into the controversy. The mere mention of its antiviral properties got my entire live stream taken down the following January. And in a response video, I did nothing more than read a peer-reviewed article in a scientific journal covering everything we knew up to that point about ivermectin's antiviral properties. YouTube took that down too. That's 2 strikes. They're supposed to give you a warning on the first one, but they didn't. They stopped uploads and monetizations for weeks, and even after I could upload again, the strikes stayed on my channel. They're only supposed to be there for 90 days, which means they should have been removed in April. Instead, it stayed on my channel until August. And in the meantime, I lost views, subscribers, and revenue. Permanently. Yeah, I'm still salty about it, wouldn't you be? Especially considering that the FDA is now slinking back in retreat of their horribly dangerous medical misinformation with little worry of anything bad actually happening to them as a result. But they just admitted in court proceedings before the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals that doctors can indeed prescribe ivermectin since the FDA approved it way back in 1986. What regular viewers might not know, because the video was taken down, was one of the points I made in the video, which is about drug repositioning. This means when a drug gets prescribed for something other than what it was initially approved for. There is absolutely nothing wrong with this, and in fact, it happens so often that it's really hard to find exceptions. Most drugs you probably take initially had a different reason for their initial approval. So the fact that ivermectin was originally approved as an antiparasitical has absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with whether doctors can prescribe it as part of an antiviral regimen. But doctors who did that were publicly humiliated, lost their jobs, and some even lost their medical licenses entirely. And some pharmacies stopped dispensing it entirely, even for antiparasitical purposes. All for something that the FDA now acknowledges is completely false. Their lawyer said in court, quote, "FDA explicitly recognizes that doctors do have the authority to prescribe ivermectin to treat COVID." This is a huge victory for doctors who were complaining that the FDA's former actions amount to illegal government interference in their right to prescribe ivermectin to their patients. Jared Kelson, attorney for the doctors, said to the appeals court, quote, "The fundamental issue in this case is straightforward. After the FDA approves the human drug for sale, does it then have the authority to interfere with how that drug is used within the doctor-patient relationship? The answer is no." And the tweet where they literally told doctors to stop it linked to an article of theirs full of misinformation demanding doctors stop prescribing and pharmacies stop selling ivermectin, which is exactly what followed. In the midst of their backpedaling, the FDA said the "stop it" tweet was a mere quip, just a fun way of relaying their concerns. They told the court that their statements, quote, "don't prohibit doctors from prescribing ivermectin to treat COVID or for any other purpose. FDA is clearly acknowledging that doctors have the authority to prescribe human ivermectin to treat COVID, so they are not interfering with the authority of doctors to prescribe drugs or to practice medicine. But the judges weren't having it. One of them said, quote, "What about when it said, no, stop it? Why isn't that a command? If you were in English class, they would say that was a command." The other judges agreed, with one saying, quote, "You're not authorized to give medical advice." There are other more subtle ways of backpedaling the FDA is engaged in. Its original page on ivermectin contained phrases like, "can cause serious harm, please beware," and called it an unconventional treatment, reiterating over and over again that it was for animals only and was not for use in humans. That stern language has since been edited out of the page with no notation about the retractions. How long will it be before people stop trusting governmental authorities who have shown over and over again to be incompetent, corrupt, and even bald-faced liars? And more importantly, how long will it be before they're finally held accountable? If you're looking for a way to support this channel, but you don't have any spare cash and you can't stand ads, you can do so by generating your own cryptocurrency. Use the links at the bottom of the description to follow the link to Odyssey.com to listen to the podcast and see all of my YouTube videos as well. Just watching videos will produce cryptocurrency for the creator and yourself. And since Odyssey is always monetized and never censored, you'll have no problem seeing all the videos from your favorite creators. You can also use the library credits you create at Odyssey to tip creators and even purchase paid content. Earn library credits through various rewards, including daily view rewards and the number of shares and invites. And you can interact with creators in all sorts of ways, including like and dislike, comment, boost a post by supporting it, repost it, and share to other sites, all while earning crypto for the creator. Easily monetize yourself and your favorite creators using cryptocurrency, without advertising. Use the link below to visit this channel on Odyssey.com and see many of your other favorites there as well. So, doubtless you've heard about yet another indictment of former President Donald Trump, this time in Georgia, and they just seem to be getting more and more ridiculous as time goes on. Personally, I'm loving it. So, prosecutor Fani Willis indicted Trump and 18 co-defendants, and that's where the weirdness began. Apparently, someone accidentally posted the indictment document while the grand jury was still meeting. Why does such a thing even exist before the grand jury was done? After that, we saw the proceedings accelerate to a rapid pace after they flew through several witnesses the next day, which basically means the grand jury was just rubber stamping what Willis wanted. You know that bit about them indicting a ham sandwich. We're also seeing what we've seen with the others, a ridiculously accelerated schedule. There's the Mar-a-Lago classified documents case, which will be extremely difficult because discovery will have to be processed by people with the proper clearances. The Jan 6 case where, according to prosecutors, the first round of discovery is 11 million pages. And then there's this one. They're all wanting to go to trial during primary season. Imagine that. None other than Alan Dershowitz has slammed the timetable in the Georgia case. He's the Harvard law professor who has represented people like Mike Tyson, Patty Hearst, Leona Helmsley, Julian Assange, and Jim Baker, as well as Donald Trump during his 2020 impeachment trial. He wrote on his Substack, quote, "I have never seen a trial with 19 defendants, a 90-plus page indictment, and this degree of complexity brought to trial in anywhere close to 6 months. It simply can't happen." Anyone who says these indictments aren't blatantly political deserves only laughter and scorn. Willis campaigned on the platform of indicting Trump, which should immediately disqualify her, and she's also got a re-election to think about. And even more laughably, Willis indicted them under the racist and Constitution-hating RICO Act, made to go against Italian-American gangsters, but now a darling of prosecutors looking to get tons of convictions. The main problem is that not only is truth a defense, so is belief. If Trump believed the Georgia election had been stolen, he's not guilty. Various defendants might have certain degrees of belief or doubt, but if they even believed election fraud was so much as plausible, they're not guilty. Dersh wrote, I am aware of no evidence that Trump himself ever expressed doubts about his certainty that the election was stolen, but it is possible that prosecutors may be able to introduce testimony that other defendants had expressed doubts or may even have admitted that the election was not stolen. This diversity of viewpoints may pose problems for the prosecution as well as for the judge, who must instruct the jury on the law applicable to each defendant. The main problem with RICO is it's used to try and sneak in guilt by association, which U.S. courts soundly reject. Each individual defendant must have the requisite intent, and it must be proven for each individual client beyond all reasonable doubt. So what we can expect in Georgia is a lot of motions. Motions for separate trials. Motions for various different rulings which might benefit some defendants but not others. Defendants may or may not want to take the stand. All sorts of issues. Of course, what prosecutors generally hope for in these cases is for one of the defendants to get scared and change his testimony, in which case all will be forgiven and their testimony used to impeach the rest. The basic witness tampering prosecutors are somehow allowed to get away with. One of his predictions has already come true. Trump's former chief of staff, Mark Meadows, has already moved to have the case moved to federal court, which just might succeed given that many of the counts allegedly happened in Michigan, Pennsylvania, D.C., and many other places outside of Georgia's state jurisdiction. And you'll have various different defendants trying to get the case in federal court in their home districts, or move to other counties in Georgia, or whatever. Dersh wrote, Justice must not only be done, it must be seen to be done. This is especially true when the main defendant is also the main candidate against the incumbent president. Although this is a state rather than a federal case, it is being brought by a highly politicized Democrat who is clearly seeking to serve the interests of her party and her preferred candidate. At the moment, it appears that Trump will be required to be fingerprinted and to provide a mugshot. The inevitable t-shirt with the mugshot picture will probably be among the best sellers of all time. The prosecutor appears to be trying to milk this case for every partisan benefit she can secure, both for herself and for her party. Yes, they're talking about a mugshot. Why do they need it? We all know what Trump looks like. It's done for identification purposes, and in cases where defendants have tons of pictures of them all over the internet, like celebrities, they often forego the mugshot. But they want it here because they just want to gloat. Of course, expect Trump to make hay with it too. With every indictment, his position in the polls just gets higher and higher. Have these people never heard of the Streisand effect? They also might want to look up Eugene V. Debs, one of the men who ran for president from prison. Although he didn't win, his arrest increased his support fivefold. Dersh concludes, the current indictment on its face seems strong. It tells a sad tale of claims of corruption, perjury, and malfeasance. But as the prosecutor reminded her listeners, all of these defendants are presumed innocent. We must await the presentation of evidence and the cross-examination of witnesses to assess the actual strength of the case. I predict the case will be weaker and more subject to challenge as it progresses to trial and verdict. Yeah, convicting the ham sandwich might be a lot more tricky than indicting it. If you're on the Wi-Fi in a coffee shop or hotel, anyone on that network can get your traffic. Do you really trust all of those strangers? For that matter, do you really trust your ISP? A VPN can protect you from prying eyes, disguise your location, and even foil government censors. It's essential in this day and age, so go to vpn.bogosity.tv and you'll be taken to BoxPN. Starting at just $2.99 a month, you can get unlimited high-speed connections to VPN servers all over the world, and they don't log connections, so your privacy is assured. Traveling abroad, just VPN home, and don't worry about what those other governments are doing. Back at home, stop your ISP from traffic shaping and messing with the quality internet access you're paying good money for. You can connect from multiple machines at once, including your smartphone or tablet, and it supports all the secure standards, including OpenVPN and SSTP. Bypass sensors and surveillance with your own secure VPN connection. Go to vpn.bogosity.tv. With every election that goes by, we see more and more ways that politicians game the system. One such way is campaign finance laws, which, as I've covered both here and on my YouTube channel, is a blatant First Amendment violation that makes it more difficult for people of limited means to have a voice in politics. And then there's all the Bogosity surrounding the Citizens United case, which resulted in the current system, which allows for political spending outside of campaigns in the form of PACs, or political action committees, as well as tax-exempt 501c4 organizations, which can participate in politics as long as they spend less than 50% of their money on political matters. 501c3 charities aren't allowed to participate in politics at all. But this expose shows how they actively cheat and how it's only one side that's doing it. One thing they are allowed to do is voter registration efforts and get out the vote initiatives on the idea that these activities are neutral and nonpartisan. But in at least one case, the Everybody Votes campaign, it's not only extremely partisan, it may have decided the 2020 election and could decide 2024. It was commissioned by John Podesta, remember him, and is funded by the Democratic Party's biggest donors to get out the vote in very limited ways, urban non-white voters in swing states. Another group, the Voter Registration Project, leveraged billionaires such as Sam Bankman-Fried's mother to raise $190 million for Everybody Votes and register over 5 million people. According to the report's author, Parker Thayer, quote, "Our researchers have discovered that the VRP's 5.1 million new registrations provided Democratic presidential candidate Joe Biden with somewhere between 1 million to 2.7 million votes across 8 specially chosen swing states during the 2020 election. If the state-by-state projections of the campaign's Democratic consultants held true into 2020, the Everybody Votes campaign's massive registration surge would have provided Democrats more votes than the total margins of victory in Arizona, Georgia, Nevada, and Pennsylvania. Biden ultimately won each of these states in 2020, netting him 53 electoral college votes. If true, it's a blatant misuse of tax-exempt money. They are not allowed to operate with either the intent or the effect of benefiting one political party over another. Yet that's obviously what Everybody Votes was trying to do, and apparently succeeding. According to the report, quote, "VRP reports that during its existence it has registered 5.1 million persons. The Corridor report anticipated that 37% of the registrants would vote, but Pew Research found that roughly 2/3 of eligible voters cast a ballot in 2020. Using those two percentages gives us a reasonable range of 1.7 million to 3.4 million actual 2020 votes produced by the Everybody Votes campaign's registrations. And after an analysis of what percentage of those voters would vote Democratic, quote, it appears VRP provided Democratic presidential candidate Joe Biden between 1 million and 2.7 million votes. Biden received 81 million votes, so the VRP gave him somewhere between 1.3% and 3.3% of all the votes he received nationwide. And more importantly, those voters were concentrated in swing states and were way bigger than his margin of victory. Quote, VRP produced more Democratic votes than the party's margin of victory in Arizona, Georgia, Nevada, and Pennsylvania. Indeed, the margins in Arizona and Georgia would be over 10 times the Democrats' presidential victory margin. Together, these 4 battleground states delivered Biden 53 electoral college votes, far more than his victory margin of 36 electoral votes. That's an impressive return on the mega donor's political investment. No doubt VRP has far more precise numbers on its voters. The IRS and Congress should request all of them. And if the report's data is accurate, it's also clear that the only such fraudulent initiatives are on the Democratic side. Quote, Not only does the left enjoy far more dark money than their foes, a fact that even the New York Times acknowledges, but right-leaning 501c4 groups, the type of nonprofit traditionally called dark money, and the type legally allowed to engage in election work, can only dream of achieving the kind of partisan election victories that hang on the trophy walls of the left's 501c3 charities and foundations. Meanwhile, there is no conservative equivalent. At most, a handful of scattered conservative charities spend a fraction of their budget on voter registration or get-out-the-vote efforts, but they don't attempt anything resembling the sophisticated, centrally controlled, 9-figure funded, high-tech operations of the VRP network, nor do the largest conservative foundations fund such work. The charitable voter registration racket, unlike most types of money in politics, exists on only one side of the aisle. If it ever receives serious public criticism, expect the left to meet the challenge with shrieks of voter suppression loud enough to wake the dead. Thayer wrote, "If the Everybody Votes campaign was a political action committee or a 501c4 dark money group, and if the organizers had just admitted they cared more about electoral results than inequality, then there would be no scandal. But it wasn't, and they didn't. And the result is an enormous scandal entangling some of the left's biggest political donors and many of its most powerful nonprofit activist groups. This is definitely an issue that warrants greater attention." Do you have children, or nieces or nephews? Are you homeschooling, or just want to counter some of the socialist indoctrination most children get in school? If so, go to Bogosity.tv/TuttleTwins, and you'll be taken to a website where you can get some great books for elementary-age children. The Tuttle Twins books are books about liberty and free market economics that include children's versions of Bastiat's The Law, Leonard Read's I, Pencil, and Hayek's The Road to Serfdom, as well as books about the Federal Reserve and how regulations protect business cronies. They'll learn about the harm caused by eminent domain, or regulations passed in the name of safety, and fundamental concepts of liberty. And as you can see from the sample pages on the website, they're all easy to read and nicely illustrated. They're just $9.99 a piece, or get a special discount as well as free bonuses when you purchase all 5. You can even buy in bulk to donate to schools and local libraries. So get the Tuttle Twins books at Bogosity.tv/TuttleTwins. And now it's time to truncate this week's biggest Bogon emitter. For years, many people have turned to NewsGuard to rate different media outlets. But, and yes, I'm sure this will come as no surprise to many of you, the company profits by downgrading independent media, leading to defunding and censoring of alternative news sources. And yes, that includes money from U.S. taxpayers. NewsGuard claims to rate outlets for trustworthiness, but the fact is, its business model puts pressure on outlets to censor or alter stories, and the pressure is much harder on independent outlets. It's not just about its ratings, it's about its relationship with advertising agencies who cut off ad dollars for content creators that NewsGuard downgrades. Of course, the legacy corporate media continues to receive high scores no matter how wrong they are. Whereas independent media can't seem to get a high score no matter how high their journalistic standards, especially if their stories are critical of the establishment. No matter how objective they claim to be, the fact is, many of their criteria, including truthfulness, is just about what NewsGuard considers to be true, or even just doesn't represent opinions they don't want to see. So, for example, our previous story on ivermectin, or the question of whether SARS-CoV-2 originated as a lab leak rather than a zoonotic transfer, if you have a perfect score and you gave the correct information about these issues, NewsGuard will trash your score and label you a, quote, unreliable source that, quote, severely violates basic journalistic standards. And that also includes views that question the severity of climate change, or are critical of the Ukraine war, or the World Economic Forum, and so on. In fact, in 2021, Media Research Center found that NewsGuard rates left-leaning outlets 22 points higher on average than right-leaning outlets. When they repeated the study in 2022, that had increased to 25 points. John Tillman, chairman of the nonprofit Franklin Foundation, which runs newswire service The Center Square, said, quote, "I've had interactions with them where it was very obvious that they were anything but objective." For another example, Real Clear Investigations was contacted by NewsGuard over its use of anonymous sources regarding the whistleblower who initiated the impeachment of Donald Trump. They asked NewsGuard if it was also asking that question of the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, NBC, or BuzzFeed, which also rely heavily on anonymous sources, as do pretty much all journalists ever. When PragerU was given a red label, their CEO Marissa Straight tried to rectify the situation. Regardless of your opinion of PragerU, NewsGuard's reaction is anything but what it should have been. It basically amounted to a list of demands to stop criticizing the COVID-19 lockdown policies, stop questioning the safety of the COVID-19 vaccines, stop talking about any COVID-19 treatments not endorsed by the government, stop questioning the seriousness of climate change, and so on. Astoundingly, they also demanded a list of PragerU's donors. There is no reason whatsoever for a news rating service to need this, other than to try and smear or strong-arm them. They also insisted the firm take down a video questioning the motives of the WEF. The bad rating caused their hosting provider, JW Player, to delist them. For another example, NewsGuard staffer Zach Fishman reached out to Anthony Watts of the blog whatsupwiththat.com about several articles covering the arrests of climate activist Greta Thunberg, which they claim was staged. Watts explained that he was talking about the manner in which Thunberg was arrested, which included a video showing police officers posing for pictures holding her while she was smiling and laughing. Watts said, quote, "They are purposely focused on destroying the credibility of websites they don't like. It boils down to a disagreement with the reviewer." Others reported that they were told the rating of falsehood was based on a single study, no matter how many other studies contradicted it. And even small errors were enough to trash the credibility of the entire outlet. It isn't pro-left and anti-right, it's pro-establishment. Right-leaning outlets can get high scores as long as they follow the establishment narrative. Former State Department official Mike Benz said that this is just a part of the broader censorship regime we've seen rise since Brexit and the election of Donald Trump. Quote, "From the 1940s until the present, there has been this bipartisan conception of foreign policy. There is this uniparty axis that was being broken apart by the rise of free and unfettered news online. The New York Times, the Washington Post, and the majors like CBS, ABC, NBC were now no longer the dispositive forces in elections around the world, particularly in the United States and across the EU. NewsGuard basically grew out of this soup. The neoconservative wing of the GOP, and pretty much all of the Democrat Party, except the anti-war left, joined together with various elements of the national security state, including the Pentagon, the State Department, and the intelligence services, to come up with basically a plan to end the popularity and availability of alternative news online. And their advisory board is filled with former CIA, NSA, DHS, and other IC figures, as well as former officials with NATO and other foreign authorities. And just to make it clearer, add in a partnership with teachers' unions and $750,000 in Pentagon funding. The fact is, you're just going to have to think for yourself about how reliable various outlets are. There really is no farming it out. Whenever people try, it invariably ends up being crap like this. So all of that makes NewsGuard this week's biggest Bogon emitter. I want to tell you about the eyeglasses I've been wearing for years. As people can see on my videos, I have a very strong prescription, which makes glasses more expensive, especially when I need computer glasses, reading glasses, prescription sunglasses, and most expensively, progressive lenses for general everyday wear. To save money while still getting quality glasses, I get them from Firmoo. In fact, I just got a pair of progressives with high-index aspherical lenses and a nice pair of frames my wife loves for just over $100. It would have been $500 to get them through my eye doctor. Not only do they look good, the glasses are durable. I've worn many pairs for several years without problems. All orders come with a 30-day return policy, a 3-month warranty, and one-on-one customer service. Go to Firmoo, that's FIRMOO.Bogosity.tv anytime you need quality glasses at a low price. Once again, that's Firmoo.Bogosity.tv. And now let's apostatize this week's
Idiot Extraordinaire.
And this week it goes to DeKalb County, Georgia, for siding with violent criminal squatters who threw a man out of his home. Just a preview of what things would be like under mutualism and Marxism. Squatters broke into a home belonging to Tim Arco back in February, just days after his tenants had moved out. He pulled into the driveway to find someone pointing a gun at him. Arco said, quote, "I just jumped the fence and ran. I didn't know what else to do. I didn't walk in on a family eating dinner. I walked in on weapons, a prostitute, a bunch of dogs in the back, my fence broken down." When he called the police on them, they took him into custody. Quote, "They told the police that I was a home invader and that it was their home. And so I ended up being arrested and detained." Since then, 2 people have died in the house from overdoses, and code enforcement has actually cited the homeowner for not properly maintaining the house he can't legally access. Arco has spent this whole time trying to evict them. After several months, he got the eviction order signed, but he's still waiting on the marshals. They've told him that he should be able to convict by September. 8 months after they violently took over the home. As if we needed anything else added to the list of things seriously wrong with the Atlanta area. So all of that makes DeKalb County this week's
Idiot Extraordinaire.
Well, that wraps up this Stand Still! How Can I Shoot You If You Keep Moving edition of the Bogosity podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please go to donate.bogosity.tv for several ways to support and discord.bogosity.tv to join the discussion. Subscribe at Patreon or Subscribestar, and you can listen early and ad-free. Thank you for listening. Until next time, here's a quote from Learned Hand. Heretics have been hated from the beginning of recorded time. They have been ostracized, exiled, tortured, maimed, and butchered. But it has generally proved impossible to smother them, and when it has not, the society that has succeeded has always declined. The Bogosity podcast is licensed under Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 4.0 International License.
Bogosity.